This is an odd and frankly quite silly idea. Sometimes I do videos analysing stuff that is pretty likely. This, though, is a massive long shot. And yet I think the concept does have some potential, even if it's only as a bit of a gimmick, which, as we know, Nintendo is happy to do from time to time. So let's take a step back and see the whole picture here. Nintendo has two major long-term dilemmas. Dilemma 1. While it's happily releasing classic Nintendo content at a decent rate, it is gradually catching up with itself. In 2018, Nintendo Switch Online was releasing Famicom content from about 30 years prior. In 2025, we hit the GameCube. Well, that's about 2 decades back from now. If in this generation we see the Wii or DS, we will be down to content that is less than 20 years old, and given how small the library of unported Wii U titles is, there's a decent chance that by the middle to the end of the next decade, Nintendo will pretty much have put everything they've ever put out onto Nintendo Switch Online, or at least everything will be available either through NSO or for purchase on the Switch, assuming that future Switch models continue to be backward compatible. Now, this is obviously great news, and they can always put out old Switch 1 games onto Nintendo Switch Online if they feel like it. But if those games have been recently available for sale, it might not get quite the same buzz. But this brings us to dilemma 2. Development times for new games are ever increasing. Okay then, two birds, one stone. What if they decided to make a new classic game? We've already seen an element of this with Mario Maker, where the team at EPD10 would make courses using Mario Maker elements which were essentially new retro Mario levels. But I'm talking, what if they went further still and had full games for classic consoles on Nintendo Switch Online, compatible with, let's say, the Super NES controller, or indeed the new Virtual Boy? The scenario isn't completely without precedent. Star Fox 2 sat on Nintendo's servers, completed but unreleased, and it was in Nintendo's vaults for years and years before the game finally debuted on the SNES Classic console. The Virtual Boy reportedly has a whole host of cancelled games, many close to finish or perhaps even finished completely, which never released due to that system's failure. If they wanted to start a line of new titles on their classic consoles, this would be the obvious place to start. They could offer these for sale through the expansion pack, or maybe even as part of the deal if they wanted to sweeten a price hike. Even in the worst case scenario, where only, say, 0.1% of the Nintendo Switch Online install base, that's about 34,000 people, make a $30 purchase for an as new classic game, well, let's run the numbers. That would still turn over $1 million in income. Now, it's delivered digitally, so there's no retailer cut, inventory issues, or other parties involved, and most of these games are sufficiently small in scale that it might be maybe 6 months of work for a couple of people to produce a small-scale 16-bit game, probably even leveraging decades-old assets. Even at these ultra-pessimistic uptake numbers, a new classic game would more or less pay for itself. But if they are also selling merch off the back of it, say more of those classic controllers or even special limited edition boxed versions of the lucrative collector's market, then the potential income from such a project could be far higher. Plus, if the games prove successful on the expansion pack, they could always release a special extended edition as a full digital download for commercial sale, leveraging the Classics app effectively, therefore, as a marketing tool. Of course, the Switch wouldn't truly have the same limitations as the systems being emulated, so there would be some extra possibilities if they wanted to flex the power of the original systems they were adapting. However, largely the point would be to play games that are capable of being played on the original system, and to some extent utilizing the restrictions of the original system as a way to drive creativity. Indie developers have been doing this for years, and usually once or twice a year there's news of some new Dreamcast or Genesis game, so in this sense it's only taking what's been happening in the indie space and carrying it forward into Nintendo's own classic line of applications. In fact, Nintendo already has got of many of its classics games on the service already, with various special modifications in place. And then there are many titles on the indie scene in the vein of Stardew Valley and Celeste, which very clearly don't look as SNES or NES titles actually played when applying a critical gaze, but do have an art style that looks a bit like the way you remember those games playing when viewed through the lens of dreamy nostalgia. What sort of games could be created in this vein, therefore? I mean, the obvious ones to bring back would be the most classic, a direct sequel to Super Mario Bros. 3 for the NES in the same style, or another title using the A Link to the Past engine. However, these seem desperately unlikely. New Zelda and Mario games are like gold dust, and they wouldn't just cast away good ideas on some niche side project. Mole Mania 2, on the other hand, well, that might have a bit more potential. And this is not to say they couldn't remix game elements to create something new. We've seen this before with NES Remix, Super Mario Bros. 35, F-Zero 99, and Nintendo World Championship, all following this tradition. But something completely original still seems like a longer shot. So if Nintendo wouldn't use their biggest icons, where would this concept have benefit? Well, I think there are a few possibilities still. Firstly, ultra niche franchises, and especially ultra niche franchises where the game developers have essentially been chased out of the industry by the need to make games feel modern. Sure, theoretically, a retro look still has appeal, but in reality, the breakout hits in this genre are fairly rare. However, some of these games have incredibly small teams in the indie space. Notably, in recent videos, I explored the case of Treasure, whose last major Nintendo work was Sin and Punishment Star successor, and who often had just two or even one person working on any of their projects at a time. Treasure haven't produced a new title for over a decade, and I think a return is incredibly unlikely. But if the title emerged as a new N64 or Super NES title, well, now things might feel a little different, as the appeal of the new format might drive more people to try a classic Treasure title and therefore discover the rest of their library. Then there's everybody's favourite lost cause, Golden Sun. I've covered in a recent video why Golden Sun is never coming back, and I really believe that to be the case, but if the Takahashi brothers did want the series to continue, they'd be far better going back to the pace they had in their early days of doing a game or two a year with a tiny core team and using the classics library as a leg up. With merchandising potential and assuming a tiny core team, a new Golden Sun game on the Classics app could be worth a small budget. Even then, I think we are in ultra long shot territory, but there is another kind of game that will be well suited, and that is gameplay demos. Think about how Nintendo first tested the gameplay style of Breath of the Wild. They experimented with the open approach with A Link Between Worlds on the 3DS, and they actually tried a lot of the open concepts, especially those linked to the chemistry mechanics for Zelda in a version of the 8-bit Zelda engine. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that there was anything close to a full game developed here, but if they did in the future want to create a proof of concept, which is a better option? Spend a year or two making a 2D title for the Classics app, or spend 8 to 10 years making a full-fledged 3D title that might then bomb? In this case, perhaps they would even make this a Zelda game, but there are other options that have potential that are still in broadly the same vein, such as a Chic spin-off, or, who knows, another return for mysterious Murasami Castle. There may even be projects over the years that ran out the clock on development but might fit a reinvention now. That long-rumoured Kid Icarus N64 project, say. Or maybe, now that Shigeru Miyamoto is spending so much time in the US supervising the film, he'll have the brainwave needed to finalise Nintendo Software Technologies' infamous but doomed hammer-swinging project, Project Hammer. Or if they really want to melt down the internet, Shigesato Itoi has said that Mother 64 was 60% finished, with some devs reportedly saying it was closer to 80%. I mean, on the one hand, finishing this and putting it out sounds like a crazy fan project, except, the cost of developing it would be tiny compared to the absolute hype bomb and money it would generate in Japan especially, and an English localization was already underway, so perhaps this would not be a repeat of the tragedy for Western fans of Mother 3. So, is there any chance of any of this happening? Look, it is a massive, massive long shot, but it's one of these things that, if you allow enough decades, nudges up towards being eventually fairly plausible and potentially even likely. I think there's a 10% chance that we see a cancelled project revived and released as new on Nintendo classics by the end of 2029, although Virtual Boy gives perhaps the best route for such a strategy to take place. I think the odds of a newly developed game for a classics app excluding SP remixes is almost too low to give, but I'll put it at 10% before 2030 since that is my lowest banding at all. For more grounded reflections on some of these franchises, do check out these videos on screen. Please consider checking out the Patreon for more, but otherwise I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.